And good evening, everyone. This is The Nightmares, the inaugural episode of the new horror podcast between myself, Rhett Gardner.
And myself, Becca.
So we've talked about this for a number of months now.
Oh god, yeah.
Almost to the point where, well, when we first started talking to each other last year, that this is something that we wanted to do, and after many delays here and there, we're finally just kind of just going for it, just going out guns blazing and just hoping for the best. So
Yeah, I want to say it's been like at least a year or so since we started talking about it.
Bloody hell, and here we are. We're finally recording it, and we're just delving, finally moving forward with it. So the Nightmares, if you couldn't already tell from the title itself, is a horror-based podcast where me, or B or Becca, sometimes we call it B, so just there's no confusion there. That we, and also special guests that we would have in subsequent episodes recorded after this, is just kind of not just generally talking about horror and why it matters to us. It's also trying to perhaps kind of lift up stones and see parts of the stone where we haven't seen before, like talking about certain aspects which may not generally be discussed, perhaps in other podcasts, or just about horror in general. With the first episode, however, we decided that because my original concept was to create basically a history of horror, like the progenitor of horror, and how it started and it just grew and transcended to many different mediums, such as art, books, and video games, and music, and things that all eventually be dissected to death. But as it's the first episode, and I'm a bit rusty, and B, correct me if I'm wrong, this is your first time podcasting ever, is that correct?
Yeah, that's correct.
So we're both pretty sort of green with everything, so we've decided to do a much easier approach to the podcast, where we would discuss who we are and to get that out of the way, and also discuss our first exposures to horror and how that impacted us, because I believe for me, horror has been a very integral part of my life. It's woven into the fabrics of my being, so to speak, if you want to put it really pedantically. So I guess we start off with introductions. So do you want me to kind of go ahead and you follow the lead?
Yeah, of course. If you go first, and I'll follow shortly after.
Okay, so my name is Rhett, as I've already mentioned, and at this moment in time, I'm just kind of like an amateur writer. I've had a book online published. It's a compilation of horror stories. I've got a second one I'm working on editing, and also a few stories on the way to make up for a third book. So I'm, writing my own horror stories, and because, again, like I mentioned, and as you'll find out later in the episode, it's really impacted me in such a way that it's actually coming out of my creativity now. That's my sort of outlet. And admittedly, I've been very rusty in the horror genre. I don't know the latest movies or haven't read any horror books in a long time until only just recently. So I'm pretty rusty. But the point of this podcast is also to kind of explore why we love this genre so much, and also kind of rekindle that flame of why it was so passionate to us. Yeah, I guess that's it for me. I guess it's your go.
I'm B, or Becca, and a big part of it is kind of exploring horror. For very much one of the first times in my life, I've experienced horror kind of throughout my life, in different medias, but mainly through literature. I'm very out of touch with the film world of horror, whereas that's something that I'm looking forward to maybe comparing going forward. Horror is something that's definitely intrigued me, because growing up, it wasn't really something that I was ever permitted to indulge. So I'm looking forward to kind of exploring the genre alongside Rhett, and I think that it's kind of permeated all aspects of our existence, even if you're not consciously aware of it sometimes. So I'm looking forward to kind of dissecting that and going from there.
Well, that's very eloquently put. It almost sounds like you revised everything beforehand. Me, I'm just like, I just say whatever comes out. That's another thing. Yeah. So because it's also a third podcast as well, like we're not like trained. I'm sure there's a lot of people that do podcasts so much. They have like
an encyclopedia of knowledge in their heads about it.
Yeah, like a vernacular or whatever. They have their own, like they have a podcast language. They have that rhythm. We're discovering that as you're listening, as we speak. So in a way, that supposedly that's going to be kind of exciting as well as we iron out all the kinks.
Yeah, very much so.
Oh yeah, and because of our wide range of interests and how horror relates to every one of them. So B was talking about literature. I was talking about films and video games and so on and so forth. Most of the episodes will be dissecting those, or just themes of horror, and also what B mentioned some time ago is about talking about how there's different aspects of horror in other genres, and perhaps we'll discuss those as well. Basically, just this podcast is an equivalent of going into a haunted mansion where you have no idea what the outcome is going to be, but we're going to brave it, and we're going to leave no stone unturned.
And we're going to drag you, the listener, kicking and screaming through the haunted mansion with us.
Yeah, that might actually, like, if we could become successful enough, we might actually own a house where we can literally do that, like a little fun, like a amusement park or something. Yeah, that'd be great.
That would be amazing.
Yeah, that'd be awesome. Like, imagine if we had like loads of fans and we just rented out a mansion and we did like a real life horror night. That'd be crazy. Like real life Cluedo.
I can actually use my degree then, like qualifications.
Yeah, it'll be actually come into play. Yeah, I know.
Awesome.
That'd be great. I should also, there's a few things, like a few disclaimers that we should mention now, so we don't have to mention them again. If you couldn't already tell, and like, some audio files will probably already be able to tell that our recording process is very primitive. I'm using Audacity to record the entire podcast, and we're just talking over Discord. That's what we got. So we can't be held responsible for any of the noises that occur outside, because I live with a flatmate and B lives with a family, so it's very difficult to basically just block out any sort of natural noises. If anything, it might even make it a bit more exciting, like we can talk and then there'd be like a sudden noise and maybe it'll give you a little fright or something. That would be
natural ambience.
Yeah, natural ambience. Yeah. And maybe as time goes on, we might experiment in these episodes. The best to do it in the early episodes where we can kind of iron out all the kinks, and then it won't affect the future ones.
Yeah, that sounds wonderful.
Yeah, yes.
I was going to say on the disclaimer front, in case it wasn't already obvious, this is maybe a mature podcast.
Oh, yeah.
So if you're not that way inclined, or you think this is going to maybe affect your sleeping habits, or for younger viewers, if it's something that your parents aren't going to be okay with you listening to, we'd maybe encourage you to check with a parent first.
Yeah.
Because we will be dealing with kind of all aspects of horror.
That's,
as Rhett said already, no stone unturned.
Yeah, so that's absolutely a good shout.
There might be a little disclaimer at the beginning of each episode, depending on what we're dealing with. If we think something's going to be particularly grim, we'll always give you a heads up, but just in case, to say that now.
Let me put it this way: we're not going to be talking about the Teletubbies. All right, this isn't the Teletubbies podcast.
No. Although I'm sure maybe there are some aspects of horror in the Teletubbies. Anyone else?
Oh, dude, yeah. Let's sun
in the Teletubbies.
That giant baby. What the hell was that all about? That's more terrifying than watching the Hammer films with Dracula and all that. Yeah, well, you know what we should do? Should we just like complete? I don't want to do this podcast anymore. I just want to watch every episode of Teletubbies and just make a podcast about that, or we could do that on the side actually,
That would
because
be the side thing.
that'll be a side
By
project. So
day
so
by day
Teletubbies
we document horror. By
Yeah.
night we watch the Teletubbies.
Yeah, and we can just call
go.
it, because this is the Nightmares, we can just call the other one the Teletubbies, and then that'll be on the site. So guys, look forward to that.
The Teletubbies, it's on its way.
Yeah, it's on its way, you know. So I think now we should just okay, so we said who we are. Now I guess we just talk about why horror has like our first exposure to it, because for me, it's just like, I think a lot of people are going to have the same sort of exposure. For me, when I was a kid, I used to watch a lot of late night programming because my parents would never really be intolerant of that, or they never really, they just never did anything about it, full stop. So there was if you remember Cartoon Network, there was they did a program slot called CNX, which later became Toonami. Yeah. So they had some really awesome late night programming where they would show all kinds of movies. Particularly, like I remember there was just like kung fu movies, or like just like sort of like world cinema, and some of those were horror aspects, I believe. Yeah, there was a lot of Japanese horror that I'm pretty sure I've seen on there, and just in general, like you can watch Sky Movies late at night and they'll have like a horror thing going on. I just watch those. Like I remember watching Rosemary's Baby by Roman Polanski. Man, that made me not want to have kids. I'll tell you that much. That was absolutely horrifying.
That was the defining moment where you were like, children aren't for me.
No, yeah, absolutely terrifying. And actually, babies are going to get brought up in a review that I have later on. So it's good that you mentioned that, because that reminded me.
Okay.
Yeah, but I think the biggest, like, because everyone's seen horror movies at least once in their life. I remember staying over at a friend's house and watching Evil Dead for the first time, having no clue as to what it was about or what I was about to see. And there was a certain scene where a bunch of trees were involved, and I couldn't sleep that night. I'll be honest. That wasn't much of a sleepover as it was, hiding under my covers with my eyes wide open sort of sleepover. I think the most influential aspect of horror for me was video games, because as opposed to watching like a spectator, you can actually be part of the experience. Which, for example, like I remember my half sister's boyfriend at the time was playing Resident Evil 2 on the PS1. And I just remember watching it thinking like, wow, that looks... I mean, don't forget, like this is like late 90s, mid to late 90s. I was a kid, so obviously the graphics back then were like spectacular and horrifying. Although the game itself is just pre-rendered backgrounds. It's not all 3D like the most modern games are. He wouldn't let me play it, obviously, because I was a kid. But when he and my sister left, I just sneak in his room and just play the games anyway. It's just like, sod it.
Oh no.
Yeah, it's hard. It was really difficult. It was really, really scary. So scary for me at the time. I think what scared me the most was because it's pre-rendered background, you just walk. Basically, it's just like portraits, and you're walking in a portrait sort of thing. So when you go into the next part, it's just an instant cut rather than a smooth transition. So you could just walk into the next room and there's like 5 zombies that you didn't see before, and you're like, oh Jesus Christ, and then they just come after you. So
sounds more like jump scares along the way then.
Yeah, unintentional, of course. It's just because of it's just because of the technology that which actually really helped. But what was the biggest deal for me was the Silent Hill franchise, which to me is still one of the greatest. Like in terms of video games, in terms of horror video games, I think Silent Hill stands on a league of its own. It's on its own plateau. A lot of people could argue there's a lot of scarier games like Forbidden Siren. I can't remember. There's a bunch of other Japanese games that are really scary. But for me, Silent Hill stands at the very top. And honestly, I think I'm just going to make a whole episode about Silent Hill, because I think a lot of people should get into that. It's very, very integral to horror in general, and it shows what horror can be in a video game. And to be honest, I think it sets standards which I still don't think could be met now in modern times. So playing those, like, well, I know when I say Silent Hill, like, don't get me confused. This is the Team Silent era, basically the original team that Konami assembled. So they made the first game all the way up to 4. So those are the games I'm talking about. Anything beyond that was made by Western developers, and they've completely ruined the franchise because they completely misunderstood what it was. Like, for example, if you play the early games and then you play Silent Hill Homecoming, which was like the 5th one, the difference is between night and day, in a bad way. So for me, like, playing those games, especially like really late at night at like 2 in the morning, I was just playing them, and it was just it gave me that sort of, like, when you watch action movies, like, they're just like, there's explosions and blood and stuff. It's not it's not as engaging as horror, because I feel like, because you're so invested in it, because there's just cause it brings up that sort of fear in you, I guess. But sometimes when we're scared, we can be thrilled in a way. Like, for example, you're going into a scary mansion and you have no idea what's around the corner, but you really, really want to know what it is. Like, the anticipation almost outweighs the fear in a way. And that's why I think video games, like, in terms of horror, is like the most impactful. I guess you could say that about books as well, because when you read, you can use your own imagination, and as you go through the pages, you can picture it in your mind and stuff like that. So you can make it as scary as you want to be, which is just as powerful. But yeah, for me, I think this all happened all sort of around the same time. So I started watching late night movies of horror, and then I was playing horror games. Like, it was kind of weird how that all kind of assembled together. But I think that's, for me, like, the reason I was playing all those games and watching all those movies, because it just brought something out in me that I felt that other genres didn't give. You know what I mean? And I think it helped shaped my character, and also to be much more prepared for the world. Because in a way, like, when you're a kid, when I was playing those games, and you become an adult, I think that's one of the most horrifying aspects, is, kind of being exposed to the real world. And, you don't really, you don't have a lot of, like, help supporting you at times. Like, you're kind of on your own. And in a way, it's kind of like walking through, like, a dense mist, and you don't know where you're going or how far you need to go, and anything can approach you at any time. And I feel like horror kind of prepares you mentally for that, and it also kind of brings out your true character in a way. So, long story short, that's what horror means to me.
I think that's a really good and kind of personal meaning to it, especially where you were saying about preparing your character a bit. There isn't really anything you can compare to real life.
Yeah.
And like the whole going out on your own and adulting, whereas horror does kind of, it can prepare you that fear in a way, depending on how you utilize it. So I quite like that. I like that one a lot.
Thank you.
I'm just trying to think. For me, I think my first experience of horror, and it wasn't even that horrifying. Horror as a medium would have been like in literature. When I was a kid, I used to read all the time, and I think I must have been like 9 or 10 years old, and I read, there's a Terry Pratchett book called Going Postal, and there's a scene in the book where the main character is confronted by a banshee. And for whatever reason, that has just stuck with me as like one of the most terrifying things I could have read as a kid. I reread it like a couple of years ago, and it's not scary at all. But that was the thing that kind of struck me as a child. And then kind of growing up a bit more, because I didn't have much interaction with horror. It wasn't really a thing that was ever really permitted in my house. Growing up in a house with like a really strong kind of faith presence. And then I went to university, and I got to live with one of my best friends, and she is mad about horror. Like, crazy about Stephen King. She's read all of his books. She loves the Annabelle movies and anything horror. She's seen it, and so I kind of got the chance to explore it a little bit then. I'll be perfectly honest, I've seen like 2 horror movies in my whole life, but I have read a lot more horror literature thanks to her. And it's helped phenomenally because, I suppose, similar to what you say, there's a finite amount of scary in the real world, and horror can kind of prepare you for that a little bit. So I think the very first horror movie I saw, and I don't think it would even count much as a horror movie, is Happy Death Day. It was more thriller based, and then Velvet Buzzsaw as well, which is a really recent one. And primarily my interest in that was in how it displayed gallery culture, but that was also, I think, really well done, mainly from an arts point of view. I'm more interested now that I kind of have more of a literature foundation in it to kind of go forward and dissect the literature aspects compared to the cinematography aspects, because I know even specifically for like Stephen King's work, some of it differs wildly between the two. And he is a phenomenal writer. And his films have been very, very successful as well. So it's kind of picking apart what's been included, what hasn't, and maybe why it hasn't, and how that affects us on our day-to-day lives. Because horror as a genre, psychologically speaking, has a massive impact on us. And in both in like helping to process information and normalizing some specific behavioral patterns. So that's going to be the thing that I look forward to exploring the most, probably. But yeah, that's my basis on horror.
Cool. What we should do is like a little book club, like as an episode where we can bring guests in and we could discuss books. And maybe like when we get fans, like if someone wants to chime in and mention a book as well, like we could bring fans into it so they could become more included with what we do. Maybe like a little book club every now and then. Yeah, in case we like run out of like if there's ideas that we either can't achieve for one reason or another, or if we just kind of run out of ideas or pressed for time, we could just do like a little podcast episode of just doing it like a little book club. You know what I mean?
I think what could be quite interesting as well is, for instance, if there's someone that wants to see us dissect and look into closer, then I'd be really interested in getting those kind of suggestions in.
Yeah, that's...
Because it drives a bit more. And we, between us, obviously you have an amazing foundation on horror as it is. And I'm fairly green, but I'm rearing to go and willing to learn. But between us, there's only so much we can know. And only so much that we'll be able to explore on our own. So having input from anyone else in the audience, that would be amazing to say, oh, have you heard of this movie, book, game, poem, whatever format it comes in?
Yeah.
Send it our way.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So we can have a look at it and go from there.
Yeah, I absolutely concur as well. So, in fact, what I really wanted to do, like as sort of like a side project for the Nightmares, is to stream some horror games on Twitch and kind of go over it. In fact, that might even be better than doing the podcast for the Silent Hill thing, or maybe I could do it side by side because it might be a different experience. Yeah. I've trust me, I would absolutely love to do that. I would happily play those games. I need to get a PS2 again though. Anyone out there who has a spare PS2, just send it my way. I'll pay you.
Contribute to your gaming addiction.
Yeah, absolutely, man. To be fair, the only game I've played is like the one I'm going to review later in like a long time. So that will be coming up.
Okay.
Oh yeah, I forgot to mention, like a lot of people probably, well, maybe they don't care, but there's going to be at least one or two people who are thinking like, why do you call it the Nightmares? It's such a very, it's kind of like, I thought it was a very surprisingly interesting name rather than just picking something like really obscure. But what I got the idea from was the Fuseli painting of the Nightmares. When I was in college, there was a course. I can't remember specifically what it was for. I think it was horror related. Actually, it was a horror based class, and they said that painting was one of the earliest probably representations of horror. Although horror's been around, I think like werewolves and stuff like that have been around in like French literature for like 1,000, like million years. In fact, I think nearly all of horror could probably predate back to like the beginning of man, or mankind. But I think that particular art piece, and what we'll do with every episode depends on where you're watching it from. We'll have links and stuff like that as well. So there'll be an email address which you can forward all your suggestions. If you have thoughts about the Teletubbies, please let us know.
Let us know. Important part of the show. Teletubbies.
In fact, like if you could focus on the Teletubby rather than anything horror related, we would appreciate that. No. I'm just messing around. They know. They know human when they hear it. So we'll put a link down, just like, or you could just look it up on Wikipedia yourself. The Nightmares by I think it's Henry Fuseli. I think he's Swiss American. But that, I think for me, like that was a very interesting art piece. I think it's meant to sort of show like what nightmares were meant to be. I think that's where the name Nightmare actually came from, was the painting, because there's a horse shown in that.
I just think from like a composite structure, it's a really interesting painting, because you've got like the I want to say like the sleep paralysis demon. Sitting on top of the lady.
Yeah, the gremlin. Yeah,
just like the horse is just observing.
Yeah, it's very voyeuristic. In fact, there's a lot of like sexual references. Some people have theorized, which actually might come into a future episode with my colleague Lily. In fact, because we haven't actually played the intro in the actual recording, I forgot to mention, shouts out to Lily Marks and Benjamin Clark, who are part of the band Gendercide, which came up with the intro, and I'm actually going to be a part of that band as well. So they're really good friends of mine, who very kindly gave us the intro that you heard at the beginning. And maybe we'll do an outro as well, or maybe we'll get some sort of background piece that we can play throughout the thing. There's a lot of things, but I just wanted to give them a shout out, because we should have done that at the beginning.
They've done a fantastic job.
They did a fantastic
job with the intro as well.
I mean, it didn't take them very long to do either, so I'm very, very appreciative of that. That gives us some production value as well. Like, what I mean?
They're both very talented.
Very good.
Like, hands down. I know you say it didn't take them long, but bruh, if you stuck me in front of one of those, whatever they've used to make it, I'd be lost. They are very talented.
Oh yeah, I mean, like I said, I'm going to be part of that band soon, so I can't wait to actually contribute creatively with those guys. And Lily's going to be potentially in one of the episodes, which she has a very interesting subject, which I'll admit now that I haven't really listened to many horror podcasts, because I don't really have the time. I have a lot of creative things I have to attend to. But I think this is a subject that has hardly ever been talked about. I'll be very surprised if it had. Maybe in like one or two obscure podcasts, but I'm really excited for that episode.
We're going to be one of those two obscure podcasts.
Yeah, the one of the two. The other one is also by us. It's the Teletubbies horror aspect. Yeah, but yeah, the Henry Fuseli painting, I'd really recommend looking at. It's a really interesting piece, and maybe I'll talk about that a bit more. That was actually going to be the kind of the beginning of what I believe to be like the origins of horror, although there were obviously hints here and there throughout history. And also an interesting fact, it also, although it's not specifically stated, it might have inspired Frankenstein, the book by Mary Shelley. Yeah, so, and also a number of other things, which then constructs like a sort of a specific timeline as to when horror became more of part of
more of a genre.
Yeah, like a genre itself, as opposed to being like part of history.
Because it's been around for, I mean, even so far back as like Shakespeare. If you look at the works of like Macbeth and aspects in that play in specific, horror's been around since the dawn of days. Like you said before, it's just not been documented as thoroughly. It's not also been as prominent
Yeah.
as it is now. Like, I would say horror at the moment is maybe the best point it's been in possibly ever for like wide range acceptance as a genre. You get, don't want to say tons of horror movies because I know that there are maybe more rom-coms made every year and more
Yeah, I would say so.
more action films and stuff, but I think we're definitely at close to the peak of where horror is, and it's going to go up a little bit further. I'm hoping it can only go up from here.
Yeah, I'm expecting sort of an uprise. I mean, there's been periods of time where like if it was like a chart, you could see it going up and down in terms of like rising and decline of like the horror genre itself. And that's something else that we can look at is just like the history, like specific parts of history where it's been very good, or where a certain genre of horror has kind of just made its mark all of a sudden, and it's doing really well. I mean, there's so many things we could talk about, and that's another reason why we chose horror as a podcast. Although in a way it's very niche, but there's like so much subject matter.
It does, yeah. It gets into every kind of aspect of media there is. If you have a murder mystery, there's going to be aspects of horror. If you have romance stories, sometimes there's aspects of horror in that. There's definitely like tense moments that are usually completely unnecessary to the story, but
yeah, man,
they're usually in that.
Yeah, there's horror. I think the things that make those kind of like, say you like rom-coms or certain action films, like what makes them interesting is the horror aspects.
Definitely, because it's suspenseful. It's suspenseful and it grabs your attention and it keeps you glued to the edge of your seat and glued to the screen. So
it's just
you try and absorb more about what's going on screen.
Like war movies, in a way, can be its own sort of horror, especially with especially like the beginning of Saving Private Ryan, where you see the good guys go on the beach, immediately get killed, set on fire, blown to bits. You know what I mean? Yeah. Like that stays with you as well. That's another thing about horror. It's just, it sticks with you.
It is. It's you were gonna say, sorry, it sticks. But it is. It kind of like resonates with you.
Yeah, that's a word. Resonate. Yeah, absolutely.
Sorry.
No, no, it's fine. You're the wordsmith. I'm just a guy that just blathers a lot. You know what I mean?
I don't know. You're the writer, so
I wouldn't say so. But that's also interesting because I think the type of audience is going to be like who we are individually, as well. Like for example, you're kind of green on the horror genre, whereas I'm kind of getting back into it and want to fall in love with it again. I think the audience is going to be the same way. So perhaps, so that's also another reason why we're doing it.
If you want like a good ghost story, I know a lot more about supernatural stuff than I do outright horror. But I feel like, again, there is a big overlap there as well.
Yeah, we could, as long as there's overlap, then no one can really say that we're not specifically horror. Although I should say this now, we might just delve into other subject matters that we find interesting and we feel that we want to talk about, because at the end of the day, we're not married to the idea of horror, although that's kind of the main thing that we want to talk about. There might be other subject matters which we may discuss, which you might not be prepared for. But
we'll always let you know.
We'll let you know
kind of at the beginning of the episode what we're going to talk about.
Absolutely. And
brief overview, so you can decide if it's not for you.
Yeah, or we can, like, maybe if we can be bothered, we can timestamp, like, certain points of conversation. So if you don't want to listen to, like, something non-horror related, you could skip, like, 5 or 10 minutes and into the next section, which would be more conducive to what you want to listen to. I think we've kind of established who we are and what some of the rough ideas that we have, and kind of explained what horror means to us, and also the origins of our name. So we kind of done quite a lot on our first episode. But
I think carry on.
What were you going to say?
I was going to say it might be an idea to mention the release schedule.
So
put out new podcasts.
What we're thinking is bi-weekly, like every 2 weeks, or maybe it could be even more. It really depends on the episode as well, like what we're trying to make, because it might involve a special guest that we need to make arrangements to have on, or if it requires a lot of research, which we have to do in our own time, which we're more than happy to do. It just, that might take time, because we're both working class. We're like white collared people, who, I think it's white collar. Yeah, is it white collar? It's like administrative. Yeah, because there's different types of
White
collars.
collar is administration. Blue collar is manual labor. I think.
Yeah, I think it's like agriculture and stuff like that. It's blue one, and then there's like pink collar and green collar. All that. There's loads.
Really?
There's like a whole rainbow.
I've only ever heard of white collar or blue collar personally.
Yeah, it's like, I think they branched out. Yeah.
They branched out.
Yeah, they branched out. There's the rainbow of colours, man. Yeah.
The whole rainbow of colours. I love it.
Yeah, man. I wonder what black collar would be like. I don't know if that's a thing. We should make that as a thing. Like, basically the jobs that only people like horror fans like us would do, like, you know, working at a morgue, or, you know, doing autopsies or something.
Yeah.
Like the black collar talkers, like the jobs that no one wants because it's horrifying.
I don't know. Some of them are interesting. Some of those jobs are really interesting, though.
Yeah, it'd be pretty cool. I forgot what I was going to say now. I've lost my train of thought. Oh, no, I remember. Yeah, so what I wanted to do, because also we're going to review things, like we've already mentioned, and just in time, I've recently been playing Resident Evil Village, the new numeral title of the overall Resident Evil franchise. I actually played, it came out last Friday, and I finished it the next day because I wanted to review it. And because it's just recently came out, it's really big part of a big franchise, and I just really wanted to review it. Hopefully, it should. I have not read any other reviews. This is all entirely my own wording. So if there are things that I did make mistakes on, then you're more than welcome to email us that. But at the end of the day, it's going to be my word. There's no influence of anything else. Have you played any of the games before, B, before I go into it?
I haven't. No, I haven't. Again, very green on this front. I'm more like a, I don't know, Stardew Valley kind of gamer.
Yeah, I'm sure there's horror aspects of that when your crops die. You think, oh God, no!
Bro, you have no idea what happens in those mines. That's all I'll say.
Oh yeah, it's like when you have to. It's like the RPG element, isn't it? When you, it's like different level of mines and there's monsters there.
There are, but we can go into Stardew Valley another day.
Oh,
I'll
yeah.
talk about Resident Evil, because I'm intrigued to know what this is about. I know there are a few people in my life that will be playing it, so.
Oh, absolutely. So to start off, so basically what it is, like the main story is, it's a follow-up actually on Resident Evil 7, which was actually very successful. It deviated from the kind of the over-the-shoulder sort of game style that it's been known for since 4 to 6. It's become like first person, which has been quite popular in horror games at the time. And the story for 7 was about a guy named Ethan Winters who went to like some swampy like sort of mansion in Louisiana because he heard from his wife who's been supposedly dead for 3 years. And then in terms of in an attempt to like kind of free her from her confines, he meets the Becca family, which is basically this psychotic family that's all infested with a sort of parasite. So that's kind of like an ode to, like, you know, the Texas Chainsaw Massacre and Devil's Rejects, you know, those psychotic families, like the kind of it was actually a really good game because it deviated so much from the other games. But also did a really good job at the same time. And what 8 was, is it was set 3 years later. You're playing Ethan Winters again, and because you've been rescued by one of the main characters, Chris Redfield, who is actually one of the biggest characters in the entire franchise. He's been there since day one, along with Jill Valentine, who was in there was a remake of Resident Evil 3 which he starred in. Anyway, yeah, so they moved to Europe where the game is set, and they kind of settled as a family, although they kind of had to hide away from the whole Baker incident, which has been kind of masked by the media as something else, but it was like basically it was like this type of mold It's kind of similar to the T virus that's reanimating dead bodies. It kind of similar to that. I can't go into the whole process; it would take all night. But so basically, what happens was they have a kid named Rose, and it seems like they've really settled. Although Ethan can't get over the past, like 3 years ago. Like he felt like it wasn't really concluded. And then what happened is, oh, and also I should have said this already, but spoilers. I mean, I've already told you what the game's going to be about. Yeah, I should have said that.
When you say that, I was like,
yeah, I should have said that. But at the end of the day, if you haven't played it, and I just told you what the game's going to like, I'm going to talk about the game, then you should have known to stop. Anyway, so what happened was they have a dinner one evening, and then Chris Redfield and his army comes along and shoots Mia down dead, well, supposedly dead. And Ethan's like, "What the fuck are you doing, Chris? Like, why are you killing my wife?" And then he ends up getting sort of incarcerated by Chris Redfield, who seemingly betrays him. And then he kind of just wakes up unconscious in the middle of like the snowy forest. The van that was actually kind of escorting him to some place crashed, and then Ethan ends up in like a nearby village where the game is set. And I won't go so much into the actual story, but basically it's him trying to get his daughter back, who's been captured, because she was being incarcerated as well. So that's kind of like the beginning of the story. Now, one of the main things that I really want to bring up is the combination of two very popular titles, which is Resident Evil 4 and Resident Evil 7. So, of course, as it's a follow-up to like a direct sequel, so the first person is still in place. It's still the same character. A lot of the characters are very similar except for the new enemies, which I'll discuss later. Also, and it had aspects of 4, which was also basically it's still one of the most popular Resident Evil titles. That's what actually kind of brought the action element into the games. As before, it was all like kind of going through like haunted mansions, like very classic horror, whereas then Resident Evil 4 turned it into more of a horror aspect, which is still really good. And obviously one of my favourite games still to play, even after all these years. So in terms of how it was similar to 4 is, in 4 you have the inventory, and it was basically kind of like a large briefcase with like squares in them, which signifies the space in which to put items in. It was a very unusual choice to bring that into this game, because the problem with that was just organising all the items and making sure everything fits. And say if you die and you didn't save, you got a disorganised pile of mess that you have to sort out. It's a real pain. And it was very unusual that they brought that back, because in 7, you didn't really have that many items that you need in the game to begin with. In fact, it was so strict with what you can actually take, it made you think a little bit more, and it made it more horrifying because you can't have everything in your possession. Whereas in this game, you can have all the health items and all the ammunition you want, so you're pretty much over prepared. Although if you want to leave it as a challenge, you can just not get the upgrades to get bigger briefcases in which to put more stuff in. That's up to you. Another aspect as well is that was also set in like kind of like a European sort of village sort of thing, at least at the beginning of the game, whereas this game, the whole game is set around the village, which is very interesting, because in 7 it was mainly like a house that you like, the Baker family's house, which was very strict, like lots of corridors and stuff, which made it more terrifying. But in this, you get to explore an entire village, which has its intrigue in its own way. And one of the problems I had with the village is it was during the winter and it was snowing, and this is just a pet peeve of mine, but when I find snow in video games, it kind of takes away the detail. So it's just basically a bunch of buildings with snow on them, and they all kind of look the same, which of course it would do in real life anyway, but it wasn't as interesting to me. I'm pretty sure, I think the ice at some point thaws out, I can't remember. But it was interesting to explore a village as opposed to exploring a house. There was much more to do. yeah, it was interesting in its own way. Um, One of the very strange things that I find in the world itself, and also as we were just talking about classic horror, funny enough, like this whole game is centered around classic horror, and that's not just with enemies; it's also with the sort of the locations like castles and things like that. In fact, the actual village, it actually reminds me of The Village. You know that fucking Shyamalan movie, where
Yes.
they all think that they're in like this like the Middle Ages, but they're actually set in modern time. It was just like that. Like they had like these
Okay.
tractors from the '60s, and all these people were in like tweed and stuff like that. It's like, have you been living under a rock your whole life? Like, I know it's Europe, right? But it doesn't mean that Europe is so far behind in the times that they don't have a smartphone.
No,
You know what I mean?
I know.
It's weird. And this is a really interesting choice by the game designers, like especially in the Western version. Is none of them sound European. They all sound
Oh, really?
American. Yeah. Like what the hell is that
Hmm.
all about? Or English. Um, yeah, it's just so bizarre. Like there must be so many European actors, like voice actors, that you could have
Oh,
got.
there are.
Yeah, and you could have
There are.
really immersed. You could have made it more immersive. I don't get that. I just think it was a very strange choice, considering.
It seems, I don't want to say negligence on the part of the people making that choice, but just a little bit.
Yeah, I mean,
Considering that there are a wide range of actors and voice actors available that
yeah.
would do those roles and do them well. I mean, you could see that with the like the Assassin's Creed Odyssey games. Odyssey
Oh,
game.
yeah.
Um,
They.
the the voice acting in that was extraordinary, you know. And they went out of their way to make sure things like pronunciations were correct and that the voice acting was as accurate as they could get it. So
Yeah,
to
man.
not do something like that when there are those opportunities, there are those people looking for those opportunities for the just to have a game where they can be themselves and bring their corner forward. It does seem kind of negligent that wouldn't be there.
Yeah, I find that it's really interesting because I felt like they did put a lot of detail into everything. Like you could clearly see it as you go. Although I was playing on the PS4, so the PS5 version would have obviously been so much more better, and it would have rendered the details much more smoothly than mine did. There was definitely some detail there. I think there was just a lot of world building details that were, like you said, were
That could have
negligent.
really made it.
Yeah, like they all sound American. It's really out of place. Like I don't know. I just they could have really done.
That's
a better job with that.
unfortunate because
It
by the
is.
sounds of it, from what you're saying, it sounds like a really well done game, and the story sounds quite well thought out. So
In a way,
in a way,
yeah, I'll talk about it a bit more. I mean, the world itself is interesting.
yeah,
And like some of the, well, yeah, I'll leave it at that and then move on. But the world had its moments. I think the whole game really just had some good moments here and there. But I'll go into that a bit more. So what I want to talk about next is the actual the enemies of the game, which is obviously very important in Resident Evil, as they're the ones that's meant to induce fear in you as you play. So the main baddies in this game is basically what's known as the Four Lords. So basically, like these noble families that will work under this holy figure called Mother Miranda, who, as it turns out, was like the mold from Seven, which was creating all these beasts and infected the Baker family, that originated in that village. So basically, she had like these mold powers and infected pretty much everyone, including these four people. So basically, I can't remember all their names. The only one I can remember, and this is the most famous character, is Lady Dimitrescu. I think that's how you pronounce her name. Who I'll discuss and also criticize a lot of people how they view her. The other three characters was basically a talking doll, a merman, which was actually quite interesting. And also just a Chad who looks like he's from the 60s. That's all I can really say about him. But yeah, they were and also serving under them were like lichens, which I've never seen in a Resident Evil game before. It's basically classic, like vampires, mermen, those sort of characters. So they really tried to make it very classic horror, like I don't know, like if Bram Stoker wrote it or something, or maybe Mary Shelley, that sort of thing. They were terrifying to an extent, but the problem is all the enemies look the same. So you kind of get bored of that after a while, especially when you have. In the beginning of the game, it's terrifying because you start off with absolutely nothing, and there's a bit in the game where you're like they just show up out of nowhere and you're completely swarmed, and there's no indication of a cutscene to say that you're moving on from the game, so you're just running around like a fucking madman as they chase you, and you're like, oh god, what do I do? How do I get out of this? And then some random giant with a hammer, and there's a lot of characters with hammers. I don't know why. I think like the director's compensating for something. It's just like these fucking dude with a hammer just shows up and just breaks through a wall, and you're like, Jesus Christ, I've got enough to deal with as it is. And at the time, it's really scary because one, you've never seen it in a game, and two, like you're just totally unprepared for it. But when I got closer into the game, I was getting like major upgrades to my weapons and stuff like that. So even if I was dealing with a horde for them, I could just shoot them with like my extremely upgraded shotgun. They'd be dead in an instant. So that element of fear kind of dissipated. The problem with the horror is with the action, like all the upgrades and stuff like that, I think it diminishes it. 4 had a perfect balance, I find. But other than that, it was it was really sad. But the I think what really brought it, like what made, I think this is one of the more defining moments is the bosses. For me, because I just think they're probably the most interesting characters, to be honest, in the game. Like Lady Dimitrescu, for example, like the tall lady, presumably a vampire, though. To be honest, there's like, I don't think she actually is a vampire. They just call her that. She was actually a really cool character, and what I was talking about, like when like criticizing people, is how they sexually objectify her. Like for example, like they just call her like mummy, like, oh please step on me, you know, like stupid shit like that. Like I was talking to Lydia about this the other day. Like women are either perceived as sluts or dominatrixes. You know what I mean? They either have to be completely submissive or completely dominant to weak-minded men. And I just think, so for example, like she's really scary too. Like she's a really cool character. You know what I mean? She's really terrifying, and the way just people completely overlook that. And it's nothing to do with her design choice. I mean, like I find it quite scary because she's abnormally tall. And she's like really pale. She's actually quite unsettling, but because of her voluptuous figure, that's kind of, everything else was kind of overlooked. And she had a really cool transformation as well, like they all do, because they all have like their normal, like humane sort of looking persona, and then they kind of transform into this weird, sort of grotesque version of themselves. And I just thought I'd bring that up because I just think it's kind of a shame. And to be honest, this isn't the only game. This has happened since forever. It's like these weird objectifications that really cool women in horror tend to get, and I thought I'd bring that up. Other than that, like she also has daughters who admittedly weren't as interesting, and they were kind of boring when they basically like get like cold temperatures would make them freeze, so you just shoot a window and they get chilly and then you just kill them. Wasn't really that interesting. But my favorite, and I have to bring this up because I don't think a lot of people, maybe they'll agree with me or not, but they can let me know. I think the next bit I'm going to talk about is perhaps one of the scariest moments in all of the franchise, in the entire franchise we're talking about here. So there's the doll that I was talking about, right? Bienviento, I think their name was, like part of the family. So basically, she's not actually a doll. It's a supposedly mentally ill woman portraying a doll and using her powers to make it like lively and bringing dolls to life. So you go to each of their individual properties basically to collect pieces of your daughter who's been dismembered, which is actually quite grotesque because she's a baby. So that was actually also a shocking part of the story. But yeah, so you go to the doll house. It seems supposedly empty, and then you get like stuck in a basement with no weapons. which is the scary bit, and basically it's puzzle based, which is very, very interesting. And one of the scary things was, pardon me, sorry, there's a doll that absolutely resembles Mia, like Ethan's wife, and you have to, like, to get clues and stuff like that, you have to dismember parts of the body to get items and stuff like that, or when you collect items, you could come back later and use them to dismember more of the body to get more stuff, which was really interesting. But then you get to a certain point where an enemy appears, and it's not just any enemy. Like, I remember walking through the corridor thinking nothing was going to happen. It was completely dark at this point, because as the game progresses, like, things get scary, like the lights go off and you're hearing stuff. The sound production is really good on the game as well. Basically, I was walking through this corridor and I took a turn, and I hear, like, something being dragged across the floor, like some slimy presence, like dragging, and I see the outline like a silhouette, and it's basically like this giant baby, and it scared the fucking shit out of me, because it was just this giant demonic monstrous looking baby. And what was really terrifying, and I thought this was such a good choice from whoever did the fucking sound production, is it actually sounded like a baby giggling, like having a good time, like, oh daddy, like stuff like that, but it was this giant baby. It was so terrifying. I've never been so, I've played horror games for a very, very, very long time, since I was a kid, so at this point I should have been desensitized. I've never been so fucking afraid of a monster in a game in all my life. I don't think there's a single Silent Hill monster that scared me to that extent. It was just a combination of this giant baby and the noises it was making. It was basically meant to resemble Rose. Yes.
Sometimes the noises that are around those are even more terrifying than the things themselves. Because I imagine if you'd just seen it, you wouldn't have been affected. But because of the noise accompanying it, that's what set you off.
Yeah, I think because I heard giggling, and then I saw the drum baby. I thought, fuck this! Like, I don't want to play this game anymore. I don't know how I'm going to progress. I don't want to. But that's also a reason why Silent Hill did so tremendously well, is because they had Akira Yamaoka, who is perhaps one of the greatest video game composers of all time, and that's got to be another episode, because otherwise we're going to be here for 7 hours as opposed to 1 or 2. Will. But what, like I mentioned, there's no weapon, so all you could do is just kind of run around it. It took a few attempts to do, and even when I saw it's coming, it's still terrifying, because it also moves quicker than you think, and there's also moments where you think it's gone, and then you start exploring, and you go up the stairs, and then it will just start coming down like unannounced. Going da da da, and I'm like, oh god, no! I've never, that's a new experience for me for horror. I think that was like one of the only times I was genuinely fucking terrified. You know what I mean? I was not expecting that.
That's extraordinary though, and that's very well done. If you're saying you've been playing horror games for almost your whole life at this point,
yeah. Absolutely.
And you're still encountering something new that hasn't really been done in quite the same way before, and if it sticks with you, like this has, I would say that is like a hallmark of the genre. If you're indulging in something, you want it to stick with you. You want it to keep you thinking and keep the wheels in your head turning. So that, I mean, hands down, sounds like a good thing.
Oh.
Even though it terrified you, it sounds like a good thing.
Dude, I was horrifying, because it was very constricted space, because it was in a dollhouse and it was in a basement, so it was all corridors. So you had to turn around immediately and find a way to get it to kind of follow you, but also kind of go around in a circle, so you can then move forward in a path that was previously blocked. But it's very quick, and a lot of the times it would just catch me and just swallow me up, and it was horrible every single time. Yeah, it was the sound. Yeah. Honestly, if you haven't played the game before, just find a YouTube clip of that. It's got to be out there by now. I'm sure there's loads of like walkthroughs. Just look up big scary fucking baby from Resident Evil. You know what? I think that baby's probably the fucking Teletubby baby, like the son. It all correlates. That's where it's been this whole time. It's just run out, Teletubbies ended. It couldn't get a gig, so it just fucking hung out at scaring people at some
I
dude's
don't know
dollhouse.
if I'm more concerning. The fact that it could be the Teletubbies baby, or the fact that you think the Teletubbies baby is still a baby. That it hasn't changed.
Well, it's a freak of nature. Of course it. Why would it grow? I mean, it did grow. It's fucking massive, but it's still a baby.
No,
Oh, it's horrible.
It's like a human being. Like, believe it or not, it's an actual person now.
Yeah, that's why I said like, oh, I'm really glad we brought up the baby from Teletubbies because look, it's a full circle. It's the Ouroboros syndrome. Yeah, it's all that. And then after that was the merman, who was absolutely fucking grotesque. He was just ugly as hell. I didn't think you could make a merman look so ugly, but they outdid themselves. So props to them. In terms of like the bosses, they're all very done individually. Although I think Dollhouse will be like the most underrated part of the whole game. If I'm being completely honest with you, especially with the baby. I think there's another, like in 4, there was these things called the Regenerators, which were also like, if you're a Resident Evil fan, those are one of the scariest monsters ever because of the same sort of element. It was really terrifying, but I think that baby is definitely up there now. It should be. I think top 5 scariest moments, that should at least be in the top 5 of people. Yeah, and then it starts getting like really ridiculous. Like there's the only bit that wasn't exactly classic horror was this giant factory, which is kind of like the second to last part of the game, which actually like it looked really cool when you first see it, like the way it's portrayed. It kind of reminded me of the Oddworld series, which was basically set in a giant factory. The first one, it reminded me of that.
Yes.
Like, maybe it was I don't think it was unintentional, but it looked really cool. But other than that, there was like these kind of steampunk looking fucking enemies, which I didn't really care for. In fact, there was a lot of Regenerator clones. Basically, there's like these humongous, like, just monsters, basically, like these muscly, humane monsters. Except they don't look as scary in this one. Like I said, there's a lot of Resident Evil 4 came into this for that, yeah. What else was there? There's something else I was meant to mention. I think the greatest aspect was probably some attention to detail in some places. The classical use, which was admittedly never done before, and also the use of the bosses, but especially that baby. I think that's the scariest part of the game. You can prove me wrong, but I wouldn't believe you. I think the biggest. Yeah, sorry.
I was just going to say, I have to look at this baby if it's affected you.
Oh yeah, it's absolutely terrifying. Listen with headphones. That's what I did. I played the game with headphones so I could hear. It was actually, they did a really good job with the sound overall, because there were times where I just keep hearing things in the village, and it just scared the fuck out of me, and it kept me on edge. Like even when you kill the enemies, like they don't necessarily regenerate. You can still hear noises and stuff, and it still creeps you out, like no matter how much you play. So I think I'm going to talk about the biggest problem, which is, I think personally, is the protagonist. I think Ethan Winters is probably one of the weakest characters in the whole franchise. He was good in 7 because I thought it would just be like a one-off thing, and what was interesting was the Baker family and how they changed from like over the shoulder to first person. They did a lot of different things, so it didn't really matter about the character then, because like it was just the things that were happening to him, and his adversaries were much more interesting than himself. So I thought it was kind of weird that they made a follow-up of this to use the exact same character, because he's completely faceless, so we have no idea what he actually looks like. There's no emotional connection, I find, in that way, because if you don't know their face, then they're just like a nobody, aren't they? I felt he was just a really weak character. He was just kind of like a wounded father, like, oh, my wife's dead and I've got to find my baby. And although I just didn't really care from his aspect, and also he was just like really pissed off all the time. He was like, oh, why is everyone dying on me? Like all this melodrama, which I didn't believe. It didn't really sold to me. What I thought would have been really much more interesting was if he died in the beginning and his wife continued, because she has much more of a connection with the child. She was actually a fighter as well because she was trained in that prior to them moving to Europe and then being taught by Chris Redfield how to train and survive. And what would have been really fucking cool to add to the gameplay, because really outside of like the world building, like the gameplay, like weapons and stuff, like although you're using like really old fashioned weapons, like it's still similar to all the other games and didn't really add much. What they could have done was maybe she has like these lichen powers, like she gets infected and she starts like transforming into a lichen or something and starts like fucking using a fist to brutally like pummel them into the ground, you know what I mean? Become very primal. See, that's never been done in a Resident Evil game, and it would have really added to the theme, and it would have been more interesting. And I think Mia would have been more of a surprising choice rather than just use Ethan, because really he adds nothing to the game. He had nothing to 7, but the game was so good that everything around him, it just kind of compensated for that. But they just used him again, and I really don't know why. He wasn't that interesting. What else was there? Yeah, I just think he was really terrible, and I think the story wasn't that great either, to be honest. The only interesting aspect was exploring the village and killing all the enemies inside, which, and how the enemies were portrayed, because again, that was a little bit different than what the previous games were. A few tidbits here and there, which I've also really liked, was you get to play as Chris Redfield for a brief moment, which was really cool. You could do that in the DLC in 7 because he was prominent in that, but that was interesting for a little while. Although it could have maybe carried on like that because he already did that for like 5 minutes. And not to mention also Ethan dies at the end of the game anyway. So they may as well just have him. Yeah, he dies. What happened was he faces Mother Miranda, who. This is actually, okay, so this is something I was not expecting, which I really, really found fascinating. So the mold, I can't remember the name of it, the scientific name, but that predates all of the Resident Evil history. That came before the progenitor virus, which eventually became the T virus and the variations. And she was actually like, she's like basically been around for years, and she actually knew the guy who founded Umbrella, which is the big corporation that's responsible for pretty much the entire series. So that was really interesting, that the actual game like was added to the lore somehow, like just even briefly, and that was during Chris's playthrough. In fact, a lot of Chris's playthrough was probably more interesting than some of the stuff he went through as Ethan. But at the end, you face Mother Miranda, and it turns out like because throughout the last 2 games that Ethan's in, like he went through some major shit. Like he was dismembered. He's been like skewered. That's another reason as well, because he seemed so immortal that it didn't really matter. Like in the beginning of the game, when he had in the beginning of 7, when he found Mia and she was like possessed, she like sawed his arm off, which was like, oh shit, he lost his arm. But then he like using a health potion, it just reattached somehow. And then that happened because they've done it so much, like you just don't really care what happens to him. It's not really, it wasn't that gruesome. But it turns out that he was actually made of mold, and he died 3 years ago in the Baker house.
Oh my god!
And then that's why he died at the end, because he killed Mother Miranda, who was like the source of all that mold. That he would in turn die as well. So he did like this really suicidal heroic attempt of just like blowing up everything to do with it, including himself. Which I just don't care. I really don't care. I think Mia, like, although I wouldn't say it would be a drastic difference by using Mia as a main character, I just thought it would have been more interesting personally, and maybe adding like stuff to the actual game that we haven't had before.
Yeah,
I think that's what brings it down. So my review, like, if I give it a 7 out of 10, sorry, that's my review. Yeah, 7 out of 10. Because I felt like it had a lot of moments of brilliance, which was let down by the repetitive and sort of overdone gameplay mechanics and storylines, which weren't completely necessary. In fact, the best way to describe it is it's just a regurgitation of 2 much more successful and much more powerful titles, which were 4 and 7. If it was more of its own, in fact, it shouldn't. If they were going to use Ethan, it shouldn't have been a main title. It should have been a spin off or something. I don't think it deserves the numeral title. Or maybe just use completely different characters and use the horror setting and maybe have it set back in time. That I don't know why they couldn't have done that. I don't know why Ethan was ever back. I think he was a terrible character, and I just think it was a really weird choice. Not to mention the director of this game was not the same director who made Seven, so I don't know why he continued to use the same characters. Maybe he was lazy.
That might, well, it might not be laziness, but it might also be where the disconnect comes in. Like the opportunity to use Ethan as a character, but not fully understanding what maybe you could do with that character because you haven't worked with him before. I think there's a lot of pressure on
that's a good aspect.
on directors and things like that, especially when they take over a role in a franchise or something that's known quite well, to make it their own. And sometimes it works brilliantly, and then sometimes, like in instances like this, where you're saying it feels just like a hollow echo of two games that were made previously.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think that's my opinion. I felt like this game tried to use the best of both worlds and came up short. And when in fact a lot of the strongest aspects were things that were completely unrelated to those games, and they should have just made an entirely different world without the use of really boring characters. Or it could have brought someone awesome back, like someone like, I don't know, like Leon Kennedy or Claire, maybe Claire Redfield. Like she hasn't. The last time she's been in a game was either Code Veronica X, which is, I hate that game with a passion, or it's just too difficult, that game. But other than that, I think she was in 6 because that was meant to be like the high budget game where everyone came back. It was like a massive game. Maybe Barry Burton as well. Like everyone loves that guy for some reason. He could have come back, but there's so many characters they could have chose or make new characters altogether, but they chose the weakest one, and that led to downfall of the game, in my personal opinion. So just if guys just buy 4 or 7 instead. I mean, you can play it if you want to. I mean, there's some really cool parts, but really you don't. Yeah, like, or maybe just buy the game and then just sell it like a day or two later, like just to get enough experience. I mean, I'm definitely going to play it again. But if you have your own opinions, you can always, you can always email in. And another idea I just had, is maybe like if we do a stream, if we record whilst we stream on Twitch, we can do like an after show, and we can have people call in, like a radio show or something, and then they can chime in and stuff like that. Like again, that be more inclusive.
Wonderful.
Yeah,
I think that'd be brilliant. Actually, we could do it over something like Zoom or there's a few. Discord's a tricky one, but we could do Discord through like a server.
Yeah. There's ways to do it.
There's ways. We'll figure them out. There are ways.
We can make a specific channel for the nightmares, and then people would just add and whatever. We'll figure it out. But the review was kind of like the sort of the ending point of the show. So it actually ended up being a lot longer than I anticipated, and my mouth is absolutely just dry as a desert. I didn't think I'd be talking that much. I actually thought I'd be less of a talking dominant out of the two of us. But there's going to be opportunities for both of us anyway.
I think also we'll thrive in different areas. I know definitely when it comes to things like games and, at the moment, cinematography, that is your field. But I will catch up, and I will definitely try and play some games. I know Phasmophobia has been on my list for ages.
Yeah.
And it's meant to be quite good.
I'm trying my best to do books at the moment, because I'm reading at work as well, like during like the boring parts of the day. So I'm reading Frankenstein, which I might I might not review that one actually, but I do have another book which I can review another time, because I just don't have the willpower to do another review. That went way longer than expected, but you can see the passion, and hopefully that comes across, and that's kind of what we'll be delivering, is like people that actually care about what they talk about, and hopefully somehow that sets us aside to everyone else. Is there anything you kind of wanted to sort of add before we conclude everything?
No, I think we have covered a fair whack of information. We will kind of, hopefully in the near future, be setting up the likes of Twitters and whatnot. And then once those are up and running, you guys can get in touch with us there if you have any ideas that you want to see done. If you want us to explore anything, let us know.
And
But once those have all been set up, then we will let you guys know. Maybe in a little video, or not in a little recording.
And we'll also, with every episode, there'll be links depending on how you're listening in, what sort of platform you're using. There'll be links and stuff like that. There won't be much in this episode because, well, to be honest, you could look those things up yourself. To be honest, there's nothing. I mean, the video games you can just easily just type in Google, but just to be helpful, we might put some stuff in the link below, and especially with an email address and stuff like that once we have that sorted out. But other than that, I think that was a very good first podcast. I don't think we've said anything too embarrassing, have we? I mean,
I really hope not.
Yeah, I can't remember how this started. It's weird, isn't it? It's
I think it started with the Teletubbies, and that's maybe the most concerning bit.
I think it was me singing the theme, wasn't it? Right at the beginning, it was like Teletubbies, and then the baby from Village came out of nowhere and fucking scared me out of my skin. Oh God, I'm gonna have nightmares about that bloody baby now. Jesus Christ. Okay, we should conclude it there, but thanks for listening in, guys. Thanks for being, at the beginning of what should hopefully be
a long and spooky journey.
Yeah, just like this long, whimsical amusement park of scary delights. Alright, have a good evening, everyone.
Guys, thanks for joining us.